Hey guys, Shouldoge here. Today we are looking at Aimstar's main series of pads known as the Lonely Star series. While it is unknown how much experience the brand actually has in making mouse pads, they officially founded Aimstar in July of 2023 and have been silently releasing new products since, including their main Lonely Star line, which we will be looking at today. There are 4 different surfaces in the lineup we're looking at today. The Sword, which is the fastest of the 4, and is described as being tied for the smoothest and having the fastest surface in the series. The Thorn is the second fastest and is described as having the roughest surface. The Gentian being the third fastest in the series and is described as having the second roughest surface. And finally the Justice, which is tied with the Sword for being described as the smoothest surface, but is the slowest in the series. I bought all of these pads from a third-party seller on AliExpress in 490 by 420 millimeters. Now, moving on to the surface, starting with the Sword. Looking at a macro shot, the weave itself resembles a coiled cross-stitching similar to the Mitrova vein, which is not what I was expecting from a supposed speed pad. The threads themselves are on the thicker side, and if not a bit thinner than the threads in most speed pads. There isn't too much texture to this surface, and I would say is much more on the smooth side of things. It does have a slightly fuzzy texture, which almost gives it a feeling of unevenness, and contributes to the surface feeling a bit slower than it actually is. I would say the pad that the Sword compares the most to would be the Mitrova vein, as they share nearly identical surface weaves and have a very similar surface feel. I would say the main things that separate these pads would the Sword does have a bit more texture than the vein, due to its fuzzy feel, which I mentioned earlier. And it is for this reason as well that I feel the Sword has just a slightly higher static frictional value, as well as having more stopping power than the vein. As this is a speed-oriented balanced surface, the frictional values are decently low, but I do feel the static friction is a bit stronger than the dynamic friction of this surface. As I stated earlier in the comparison of this surface to the vein, it is slightly more textured, which gives it a bit more stopping power. This combined with the frictional values makes this pad great for low to medium movement, target switching games, or scenarios. The surface of this pad is quite even in terms of feel, though I would say the x-axis has just a bit more of that fuzzy texture to it than the y-axis. This pad does have sort of a glossy, heat-pressed feel to it, which would usually not pair well with sweaty hands, but I haven't had any big issues with that, surprisingly. This surface does also have good humidity resistance, especially seeing how bad the humidity still is in Michigan. I would say this pad is more sleeve usable than sleeve friendly, as it works well enough with my Kibu sleeve, but isn't usable with any of my other sleeves. I would highly recommend using a sleeve on this pad though, as with that glossy feel I mentioned earlier, it can easily drag your forearm. I'm not a super big fan of fuzzy texture of this pad just because of the frictional or performance implications, but also because it makes it harder to tell if there's actually debris on your pad or if it's just the texture of the pad. It isn't too hard to brush debris off, but it's the texture of this pad that makes it hard to tell if your pad is actually clean or not. And here is an audio test of my Scyrox V8 with these magic ice dot skates moving across the surface as an example of what this texture should sound or feel like. Now, moving on to the surface of the Thorn. Looking at a macro shot of this surface, the weave of the surface of this pad is quite tight and there isn't much fraying. It is very chaotic and doesn't follow a pattern as cleanly as other similar rougher surfaces. The surface of this pad is quite textured, leaning slightly toward rough territory. It isn't rough enough to be abrasive to the skin, but I couldn't recommend it to anyone with sensitive skin, at least not without a sleeve. It does have sort of a glossy, heat-pressed feeling to it, which most of the other surfaces in Aimstar's lineup do, but this one especially more so than the others. While my collection of rough pads isn't nearly as expansive as my collection of smoother pads, I will say a pad that does fit the niche that the Thorn provides would be a pad I reviewed recently, being the Darmo Shark AP01. Both of these pads feature a more balanced surface and have fairly similar frictional values, though I will say that the texture of the Thorn is a bit more fine than the texture of the AP01, which is likely a result of the difference in surface weave between these two pads. If I were to guess just looking at the macro shots, neither of these pads would be rough enough to fall in Hien territory, being just a notch above the level of texture the Zero has, as I stated earlier. I would say the static friction is definitely the highlight of this pad, with it feeling a good amount lower than the dynamic friction, as I don't feel much tugging at all when changing directions or starting a movement with this pad. While continuing a movement though, it does feel like it's made with intention as you feel the texture beneath your mouse skates. This pad does have a very nice amount of stopping power due to its texture. It's not a matter of pressing into the base, more so than it is a matter of pressing into the surface of this pad. The glossy feel does contribute nicely to this, as you can still lightly glide along the top without it feeling rough. Due to what I believe is from the more chaotic surface weave of this pad, there is not much of an X and Y differential to be felt on this pad texture-wise, and there doesn't seem to be any difference in performance from what I feel either. While humidity hasn't affected this pad too much, sweat can be an issue with the glossy surface, as I feel my forearm catch with the little stress, which forces me to wear a sleeve with this pad unless you can manage to keep up temperature-wise so that your forearm doesn't sweat. I would say this pad is more sleeve usable than sleeve friendly, as the only sleeve I can really recommend with this pad would be the Kibu sleeve, as it slides well on the X-axis but slightly catches on the Y-axis. I wouldn't recommend use of any other sleeves I own with this pad, unfortunately. But if you have sweaty forearms, I would encourage you to get your hands on the Kibu sleeve if you don't have one already for this pad. Due to the textured nature of this pad, I don't find myself having to try brushing off debris nearly as much as other smoother surfaces. Additionally, due to the much tighter surface weave, it's hard for debris to get caught between any of the threads, making it much easier to brush off as well. And here is an audio clip of this surface on my Scyrox V8 with the Magic Ice dot skates, as per usual, to show the texture of this pad. Moving on to the next surface, this one being the Gentian. The weave is consistent in its pattern, but oddly enough, it almost looks like some of the parts of the weave are less coiled up than others, not leading to any fraying of any sorts, but rather a looseness, which I believe results in its smoother and slightly softer texture, different from other Zero clones like it. The general feel of this pad is best described as a less rough feeling Artisan Zero. While it does have a definite texture, it does feel a bit softer and a tad smoother, which could also be from the heat treatment process with it having an actually printed surface. Seeing this pad is an Artisan Zero clone, at least in terms of its surface weave, it would feel inappropriate not to use the Artisan Zero as a comparison to this pad. I specifically have the soft style base on my Artisan Zero, with the Gentian's base being a tad more plush. While these pads have very similar dynamic friction, I would say the static friction especially sets these two pads apart. As with the much more defined texture of the Zero, it feels like the more you press into the surface, the stronger the static friction and stopping power will be, while getting rougher in the process. Meanwhile, the Gentian feels just about the same gliding across as pressing into it, if not having a bit more scratchiness when you press in, but none of the frictional values change dramatically. When lightly gliding across the surface of this pad, the static and dynamic friction of this pad feel very balanced with one another, but when I press into the surface, I feel the static friction become a lot stronger, but the dynamic feels around the same, if not becoming just a tad more stronger. Similar to what I stated earlier with the static friction, the stopping power isn't anything special when lightly gliding across the surface of this pad, but when I press into the surface, I feel the stopping power become much stronger, giving this pad a lot of variability. While I would say the Y-axis is only a bit more textured than the X-axis, I will mention that the X-axis does feel as though it has a bit more static friction than the Y-axis, meaning it would probably be best with games like Valorant or CS that have flicking aspects without much of the aspects of vertical movement. I unfortunately can't say that this pad is sleeve friendly, as it really only performs decently enough with my Kibu sleeve once again, with all my other sleeves catching too heavily on either of the axes for me to recommend them. The surface of this pad is fairly easy to keep clean, as large debris brushes off easily, and for the smaller debris that can indeed get caught between the weave, It's not too noticeable while playing, and you can pick it out with tweezers if it becomes a real issue. And as I did with all the other surfaces, here's an audio clip to show that texture more clearly. Last but not least, the last surface, the Justice. Looking at a macro shot of this surface, the weave doesn't have too much fraying, especially considering its bias and control, but it is quite loose and you can see some threads are looser than others. The surface of the Justice has a smooth feel to it, similar to the Infinite Control for example, but unlike that surface, the Justice has a slightly much softer and fuzzy feel to it. It's silky smooth and I feel like I can rub it without any abrasion whatsoever, but at some points I do feel like dead skin or other skin conditions can become a little bit of an issue as you feel it catching onto the surface. Feeling the surface of the Justice and comparing it to WL Mouse's Sword, I will say these pads are very similar. Not only do they have a very similar surface weave structure, but the overall feel and frictional properties are very close to one another. Both of these pads feel very smooth and soft to the touch, though I will say the WL Sword does have a bit more of that cool marshmallow feel to it, similar to the Infinite Control which I was mentioning earlier, while the Justice has more of a fuzzy or fluffy smoothness to it. Another difference being that the Justice does feel a bit more fluid than the Sword, but the Sword does have a noticeably lower static friction than the Justice. This pad is leaning more toward the balance control side of surfaces, and while the frictional values are comparable from a first touch, the static friction does feel the tiniest bit stronger if I were to say. The static friction is fairly consistent, but the dynamic does become more noticeably strong when pressing into the surface than the static friction. When not pressing into the surface of the pad, the stopping power feels like it leans more towards the balance side of pads, but when pressing into it, it does become a lot more stronger, leaning toward the control side of things. Overall, though, this feels like a more controlled balance surface than a pure control surface. There is definitely a texture difference between the X and Y axis, with the Y axis feeling more textured than the X axis. It does also noticeably have much stronger dynamic friction, which is pretty interesting, but for practical purposes makes it best for TAC FPS games like CS or Valorant. While I don't feel too much of a difference with sweat or humidity, some report this pad not being very humidity resistant and becoming slower with higher humidity, but I have yet to experience that for myself. I would say this pad is sleeve friendly as it works well with all of my sleeves, with only some of them needing to be inverted. The surface is a bit harder to keep clean as debris is really able to get stuck between the surface weave and will require tweezers or picking it out with your fingernails. And of course, here's an audio clip to show that texture more clearly. Now moving on to the base of all these pads are made up of a star polyurethane, which as the name suggests consists of polyurethane and is listed on the images as 2.5 out of 5 stars plushness. Okay. While the base isn't sticky, it doesn't slide around during play unless you tug at the corners or push in especially hard. And if it does become a problem, then you can spray a bit of water below the surface to temporarily increase the adherence. The base is listed at 4mm, and when measuring the pad with digital calipers, it does indeed hit that mark. The base definitely has a plushness, one that I think is most comparable to Artisan's soft style bases, but I would say the Star Flash base is a slight bit more plush than it. While the Star Flash base is not nearly as adherent as Metrova's polyurethane soft or PU mid bases, the Star Flash base does its job, and I don't ever find myself struggling to keep the pad in the same spot. Additionally, you can always drop a bit of water beneath the base and it will increase the adherence of it temporarily. While the rebound isn't as quick as pour-on bases, the strength of its rebound is comparable, and especially with the tighter weave options such as the Thorn or Sword, I don't imagine dot skates becoming an issue, though I can't say the same with the Gentian or Justice. Moving on to the stitching. The edge stitching is more so its own part of the pad rather than meshing with the rest of the surface, and it reminds me of the stitching you would find on Infinity Mice's pads. The stitching does stay consistent throughout all the surfaces as well. The stitching is more on the firm side of edge stitching, but it isn't firm per se. It's certainly more firm than the rest of the base of these pads though. The stitching is very below the surface of these pads, and I doubt anyone would feel their mouse crossing the edge, regardless of what kind of skates you have. Moving on to quality, none of the surfaces are coated, but some of them, mainly the Thorn, have a more waxy, heat-treated feel to them, more so than the others. There aren't any spots where I can feel the speed or tactility of these pads change on any of the surfaces. The printing quality on all the surfaces is very nice, and the edges are nice and sharp. While the designs aren't colored, there is still a good amount of depth with the designs, though I will say the Thorn noticeably falls a bit more flat than the others. With all the descriptions of this pad being in star ratings, it's hard to say if the information given is accurate or not, but overall I will say the Sword is not a speed pad by any means, more of a balanced speed pad, while the Thorn is very close to matching the speed of it. There is a logo which, depending on the surface, will either be in the top right or top left hand corner, and is printed into the surface, meaning it will have no impact on performance as far as that goes. Moving on to the base, the nice thing about Star polyurethane bases is that they seem to be harder to mess up. So the surfaces of all these pads are very even, and I don't feel any bumps on the surface at all. However, on my Gentian, there are some creases, which, given that could have happened during the shipping process, I'll give it the benefit of the doubt this time. The dimensions, however, are even on all the surfaces except for the Thorn, which is 49.5 by 41 centimeters rather than the listed 42 by 49 centimeters. The base stays consistently plush when considering it unaffected by the surface weave. It's very even. Moving on to the stitching is very even on my copies. The corners aren't over-stitched either. It's very good stuff here as far as edge stitching goes. The implementation for where the stitching meets is decent and is placed near the bottom right of the pad for all the surfaces, except for my copy of the Thorn, where it's placed near the top left and is much cleaner than the others. There has not been any fraying per se where I've placed my forearm, but the edge stitching does seem to have a bit of a fuzzy texture in general, which you can see when you look closely. Moving on to customer experience, as for the customer service, there isn't really an official Aimstar store which you can purchase these pads from, at least not in the US, so I can't say much on that topic. But while I couldn't find a Discord or YouTube, Aimstar does have a Twitter where they have newer products which I couldn't find anywhere. But they are a bit inconsistent and had a year time between 2024 and 2025, where they were completely inactive before returning again and then going inactive again. Once again, I didn't purchase these pads from any official retailer, so take this with a grain of salt, but the seller I did purchase these from, Digital Galaxy, did a pretty decent job at getting these out to me without taking an egregiously long time to ship. Now, as for the price, from AliExpress, each one of these pads totaled to around $21 per pad, which is incredibly cost efficient considering everything you're getting with the polyurethane base and below the surface edge stitching. There is supposedly flat packaging somewhere in the world, but I had to have it rolled up when purchasing from AliExpress. You might be able to find a seller that's willing to ship it flat, but I would just take it rolled up. Though maybe order each pad separately so the seller doesn't roll them up all in the same tube, which could cause creasing like it did with my Gentian. Did not come with any other accessories, though I'm unsure if the flat packaging does come with other accessories. And at $21, these are some of the best sub $30 mouse pads I can recommend, which says a lot considering how many I've reviewed at this point. In conclusion, I would recommend the Sword or Thorn if someone is looking for a bounce pad on the speedier side, depending on if they're looking for something smooth or textured respectfully. I would recommend the Gentian to someone who wants a softer Artisan Zero experience, and I would recommend the Justice to someone who values skin friendliness in a control pad above all else. And I would rate the surfaces as follows, with the Sword being a 78 out of 100, the Thorn being an 84 out of 100, the Gentian being a 79 out of 100, and the Justice being an 81 out of 100. I would certainly buy from Aimstar again, especially if I'm looking for a new mouse pad to play around with, but only have $21 to spend. With all that being said, thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.